One of the strangest questions I've had over the last few days is, and just based on a few observations, is this obsession of American politicians with the achievements of Henry Kissinger. Now, Henry Kissinger is said to have been a brilliant tactician in the sense that he played realpolitik with Asian countries, communist countries, especially in developing economies outside of America, which he thought would help America's effort in winning the Cold War. And a lot of his efforts have been highly successful in making America, the sole superpower for like 20, 30 years. And they really did everything they could to undermine Soviet relationships all over the world. One of the advantages Kissinger had going for him was the idea of democracy and, free market capitalism, which are good, which are much better than communism, especially the way it was implemented in Soviet Russia. Now, one of the issues with Henry Kissinger's methods is how much blood really ended up being on his hands, and how his desire for political gain and maintaining political power meant that many people had to face the loss of lives due to his decisions, and a lot of the macro-political structures all around the world usually amount that to for the greater good. And one of the most evil statements I hear all the time. I understand that no political movement can happen without bloodshed. No movement in general can happen without bloodshed. There's always going to be somebody dying because of it. But the scale to which this happens is very important. One of the biggest policy decisions America takes today is sanctioning countries, meaning restricting the flow of trade in and out of countries which they deem unworthy of trade because of so-called moral reasons. And the idea is not that American businesses cannot do business there. The idea is that anybody cannot do business with those countries. And usually this ends up in huge political and economic turmoil in these countries. One of the examples, there are several examples for this. Now, a lot of countries have got failed systems. The beauty of sanctions is that sanctions intensify the failure. Sanctions are basically punishment for not following your masters, and America does act like the masters of the world a lot of times. One of the interesting cases is with Cuba, right? So Cuba came out of the revolution of Che Guevara, and they implemented a system which I think is a failed model. It won't work, and it didn't work. But what made it worse was America's sanctions. Now, if America didn't sanction Cuba, I do think that Cuba would be in a much better position, in the sense that they would have more wealth and less poverty. But that doesn't take away from the fact that their internal political and economic structures were already terrible, but sanctions do make things worse. Of course, one of the major questions about all of this is, why is Henry Kissinger so famous? It's because during the height of the Cold War, and even before the Cold War, after the Cold War, Henry Kissinger was totally the guy who made the deal. He was the deal breaker for any American president, whether that's Richard Nixon or whoever it was. Henry Kissinger was the deal breaker. He knew, he had diplomatic connections and relationships with all kinds of foreign leaders. Even many American presidents those days and even today don't really have that kind of level of diplomatic connections. His ability to negotiate is negotiate at all costs. Negotiate not just in good faith but bad faith, but just his skill at negotiation, his ability to capture the people he is trying to make deals with, all in the interest of protecting his political power and basically the power of America. But one of the things that makes Henry Kissinger quite interesting is that he managed to get himself a great public name to the point where the American public, have a vague idea about Henry Kissinger. But why is all of this so important right now? He's a very old man, and but he still does advise presidents and prime ministers. So one of the issues here is that you could say Henry Kissinger very much had ties with the CIA, Pentagon, and the deep state elements, and he was very much one of the biggest driving forces of these elements. So it's almost like every US president needs to have spoken to Henry Kissinger before they could make, decisions for the CIA or whatever. It's an interesting dynamic. But one of the issues that really crop up, and the questions I have is, why do American politicians like him? It's a very interesting topic because a lot of politicians are trying to emulate him on foreign policy, always. Joe Biden is doing exactly that. He wants to be better at achieving foreign policy goals than Henry Kissinger. In fact, he's not even deviating from Henry Kissinger's tactics. He's using the exact same playbook. And that's what is crazy, right? And I think that's a major difference from how Trump dealt with foreign policy, because I do think a lot of Trump's deals were made in a more, let's say, with goals of peace or, achieving peace through negotiation. Of course, he did use force, a lot of force in many countries, and he did fund a lot of proxy wars in the Middle East. It's not saying that Trump didn't do anything bad. It's just that Trump really did a few things in trying to establish peace with the Middle East, which were really good, especially all those deals in relationship with Israel. A Biden type of guy, a Henry Kissinger type of person would never make those kind of deals. They would never think of brokering those kind of deals because the style that Trump uses is brash, it's abrasive, it's brazen, but it's not disrespectful. It's very respectful, and this is the difference, right? Biden, Henry Kissinger, whoever is there in State Department right now that follows Henry Kissinger's principles, their approach is that they don't respect friends of America or enemies of America or just partners of America, whatever it is, they don't respect them. This is the difference with Trump. He didn't like many people, and he was very rude to many people, but he had respect because he realized that the people of those countries kind of accepted them, and I think that's a very interesting way of looking at how you make diplomatic decisions, at least at a foreign policy level, especially at the level that America is in, because America are, international deal brokers. So I think it was a very refreshing tactic. It was very limited confrontation, it really focused on not spending too much on military. And this is one of the reasons why Trump always boasts that, he was pulling out of the Middle East, he was bringing back the troops, is because some of his techniques really didn't need that much confrontation. The Biden and, Kissinger tactic does need that kind of confrontation. Of course, I don't want to call it Biden tactic because it's Henry Kissinger's tactic, but this weird obsession with, trying to emulate Henry Kissinger really is. It's kind of getting weird at this point. I mean, Henry Kissinger always gets mixed reactions with the American public because on one hand, he won the Cold War for America. Now, of course, he was not the only one who was involved in it, but he was one of the major guys that were involved in it. On the other hand, the way he achieved it was not really all great. It's not respectable in the grand scheme of things. If he was to stand in front of the judgment seat of God, he would be condemned for the kind of deals he made. From a moralistic perspective, it's impossible to justify Henry Kissinger's actions, and yet Biden wants to do exactly that. Right? And one of the ways he's doing this, and why this concerns, is that he's trying to rope India in. He's trying to bring India to making these kind of deals, to contribute to this. It's almost like the NATO alliance, but except at a global scale, and that's not really a good thing. See, the NATO was established to maintain certain security, to maintain a security apparatus on the European continent against rogue nations like Germany or whatever. But in the absence of a rogue nation or any of those elements, what has happened is the NATO countries didn't have to spend too much on the military, except Americans' weapons manufacturers don't like that. So you have to ramp up, you have to create these scenarios. The Cold War was a great simulation for how an arms race should happen, and it's kind of a chill reminder of how nothing really happened, and yet a lot of money was utilized. A lot of money was dumped into weapons manufacturing, and American debt really started from that point on. The idea that you could leave the gold standard, print money, and create a debt-based economy came from this desire to compete heavily in the weapons manufacturing space. And when the NATO countries do not need to spend money on military equipment, given that most of the activities are monitored by intelligence agencies, and intelligence reports don't really have any war coming in. So what happens is, when there's no reports of war, you don't need to sell weapons, you don't need to buy weapons, and that's not good for a lot of people. And this is one of the reasons why the NATO is, I don't want to say it, but it's, my assessment is because they have deviated from their goals. And that's kind of that's an indication of the failure of the NATO, in the sense that they have kind of achieved their goals, but they've also deviated from it terribly, and that's not good. When the NATO has deviated from its goal, it means something bad is happening. But I don't really understand this weird obsession with major politicians trying to emulate Henry Kissinger. It's almost like Biden wants to have a name. He wants to have a legacy. He's one of the best presidents ever. I mean, think about it, right? He's trying to bring in a major infrastructure bill, the size of which came out of the Second World War from Franklin D. Roosevelt, with the New Deal, gaining Franklin D. Roosevelt the name of creating one of the biggest middle-class economies in America, in the sense that he was able to lift millions of people out of poor living conditions into middle-class living conditions with the infrastructure packages and his New Deal proposals, and Biden wants to emulate that. Now what's happening is that he sees Henry Kissinger as a Cold War hero. He wants to emulate that. So he's creating Cold War scenarios where they don't even exist. And that's what is interesting. Because it always seems to come down to something that we're not being told. And that's usually not good. Politicians' weird obsession with Henry Kissinger truly has to stop. And I hope Biden will be the last generation that has this obsession, because That's not good. That's evil masquerading as good, and that's never good. Thank you for listening. Consider liking the video and comment if you have an opinion. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos of this kind. Thank you.